And just because he isn't perceptible, though, doesn't mean he isn't there. This is a confusion that happens. And I think that for people that are questioning whether or not God exists, I think it's a lot easier to be someone who's agnostic than it is to be someone who's atheist, because an atheist would have to say, God does not exist. I don't believe in him. And they're using very, very poor instruments, just like that fisherman. Have you ever wanted to see God more in your life? Have you ever wanted to have him take part more in all the details? I remember being a little kid, and I was at a stadium with a lot of people. I was probably like 5 or 6 years old. And my parents, they had mentioned that they needed something from the cooler, and there was a cooler at the car, or I can't remember exactly what it was. For some reason, I decided to help them out being a young kid. And when I got down, walking through the stadium, I got the cooler and all the stuff, but I couldn't see above people. There were so many people there. When you're a little kid, adults seem like double tall, and I couldn't see where I was. It was a big stadium. I was totally lost. And the only thing I knew how to do, because I couldn't find my way back to the seat, was I decided to go back to the car. And so I walked out of the stadium being a little kid, and I walked down the road. And at the time we had this 4Runner, and one of those 1990 4Runners that are really cool. And I remember being with the cooler, and I sat on the cooler, and I just started praying, right? And really, like, so much of reality, so much of the things that we think are going on may not be always the things that are going on. In fact, there used to be this fisherman who was also a scientist. And one of the big things he wanted to solve was he wanted to find out which size of fish were the smallest in the ocean. So he cast out a net, and he was catching fish every day, and he was logging his notes, and he was keeping track of all of the fish, right, and their sizes and how big they were and how far out at sea and the size and everything, all that kind of stuff, because he was preparing all these logs for these other scientists to present his findings to. And so after he put everything together, he called all of these scientists together, and he said, I'm going to tell you the smallest size fish in the world, right? What the ocean has, what is the smallest fish in there? Yeah, and he gets up and he says, the smallest fish in the ocean are 2 inches, only 2 inches. And another scientist raises his hand, and he asks him, what size were the holes in your net? Yeah, and really, when we're thinking about God, right, we don't always have the tools. We don't always have the necessary resources to measure him, to observe him, to really know that he's in our reality, right? And each of us experience reality through our 5 senses, our sight, sound, our hearing, right? Feeling, smell, and taste. And we also engage in language as another way to interact with our reality. Now, when we're thinking about God, right, we are only limited to those senses that are there. Yeah, only those 5. Do you really think there's only 5? Are these the only senses that exist, right? And the issue is, when it comes to beliefs about God, that God is rarely perceptible to our 5 senses. Now, I say rarely because we have record of God, or at least the Lord, appearing to Abraham, Jacob, Moses, Jesus Christ, and Joseph Smith, right? And those examples actually happen far less often than God being completely invisible to our perception. Yeah. And I remember being a little kid and wanting to see God. And I was just a little kid, and I was praying, and I was mad at my parents, and I wanted to see him, and I told him to come. And I remember being a little kid and getting these thoughts in my mind that said, now's not the time. I'll come to you when I can. Now you can just be happy, basically, is what he was saying. And in Exodus 33:20, this is an interesting scripture that was given to Moses, this saying from God. And he said, thou canst not see my face, for there shall no man see me and live. Now, this is a really controversial scripture, right? Especially in an LDS context, because Joseph Smith saw God the Father according to his first vision. And in any case, we know that God is less likely to be available to our perception, less likely to be actually seen with our physical eyes, less likely to be heard with our physical ears, or felt with our physical body, or smell or taste, right? That doesn't really happen very much. If it does, it's very rare. And just because he isn't perceptible, though, doesn't mean he isn't there. This is a confusion that happens. And I think that for people that are questioning whether or not God exists, I think it's a lot easier to be someone who's agnostic than it is to be someone who's atheist, because an atheist would have to say, God does not exist. I don't believe in him. And they're using very, very poor instruments, just like that fisherman. Yeah. That fisherman that threw his net out and was wondering what is the smallest size fish that exists. And when he threw the net out, he only caught fish as small as 2 inches without realizing there was holes in the net. Likewise, there's holes in how much we can perceive in reality. For example, we can only see 0.0035% of the light spectrum. That is a very small percentage. In fact, that's of the light spectrum that we know of that exists. There could be even more of the light spectrum. It could be an infinite light spectrum. We have no idea. And hearing, let's talk about hearing. There's even a concept of ultrasound and infrasound. So infrasound is below our ability to hear, and ultrasound is above our ability to hear. So we know that sound even has waves that we can perceive and then waves we cannot perceive. So even with our 5 senses, right, we can't track everything in this world. Yeah. Not only that, even if you could, the amount of information that you can consciously process in your mind is just a tiny, minuscule fraction compared to the amount of information that your unconscious mind receives. Your unconscious mind receives 11 million bits of information per second, and your conscious mind can only process 126 bits of information per second. So we only can be conscious of so much, and very, very little are we actually conscious of compared to what we are unconscious of. And if you even talk about smell, right? Dogs smell things humans can't. If you talk about taste, right? There's even a time where COVID made people not be able to taste their own food, right? So even that was beyond their perception or out of their perception. So we have to think, just because we can observe with science or we can use the instruments that we have, it is impossible to measure everything because our senses and even our instruments aren't sensitive enough to measure things in our reality. And if we look at Mark chapter 8, verse 18, Jesus Christ says this, having eyes, see ye not, and having ears, hear ye not, and do ye not remember, right? This is almost comical, because Jesus Christ would certainly understand that there is so much more to reality than we can perceive. There's so much more beyond what we are able to measure with our 5 senses. And it's kind of comical, right? You have eyes. Can you not see the kingdom of heaven? Can you not see that I am the Lord your God? Having ears, can you not understand and hear what I'm saying and have it make sense to your mind spiritually? And do you not remember, right? This is another thing, another sense that we might say we have is memories, right? Remembering things versus predicting things. Yeah. And besides, who says that there are only 5 senses, right? Like remembering, having memories. For example, perhaps we have a sense of dimension, as in sensing 1 dimension through 3 dimension. And maybe there's less dimensions than 1 dimension. And maybe there's certainly more than 3 dimensions that scientists have been able to theorize, at least, that exist. And once again, we cannot actually observe with our eyes, ears, smell, taste, or feeling anything beyond 3 dimension. So our senses are not a good measure of God, right? We just don't have the ability to notice him all the time. Literally, God could be standing right in front of you in this moment, and you could be totally blind that he's there. Even angels, even spirits, anything around you. There could be so much around you right now, ancestors, angels, God, and other things, right, that you are totally unaware of because your five senses are so limited in this reality that you live in. And Joseph Smith received a revelation in Doctrine and Covenants, section 121, verse 7, that is LDS scripture. There is no such thing as immaterial matter. All spirit is matter, but is more fine or pure and can only be discerned by purer eyes. So the spiritual realm, right, it can only be discerned by purer eyes. So when you have those pure eyes, you can actually begin to see the spiritual things around you. And it's not necessarily seeing with your physical eyes. It's seeing with pure eyes. It might not be a physical thing that you see. You might see it in your mind. You might see it with your spirit. Or you might see it with your physical eyes, or at the same time. It is possible. Now, the thing is, and one thing to really understand, is that at some point, humanity was cut off from the presence of God. And in 2 Nephi, which is also LDS scripture, this is in the Book of Mormon, chapter 2, verse 6, and because man became fallen, they were cut off from the presence of the Lord. And it's true. And in Matthew chapter 13, verse 14, this is in the New Testament, and in them is fulfilled the prophecy of Esaias, which saith, by hearing ye shall hear and shall not understand, and seeing ye shall see and shall not perceive. For this people's heart is waxed gross, and their ears are dull of hearing, and their eyes they have closed, lest at any time they should see with their eyes and hear with their ears, and should understand with their heart, and should be converted, and I should heal them. It's showing these verses right here. We are fallen from the presence of God. We can hear, but we don't hear. We can see, but we don't see. It's all paradoxical, right? If you believe that the only thing that exists is what you see, then you are living a lie. There is way more than exists than what you can actually perceive, right? And when your eyes are open and you hear with your spiritual ears and see with your spiritual eyes and your heart, then you can begin to perceive God. And really, God says that he's among us. And in the Old Testament, this is in Joel chapter 2, verse 27, and ye shall know that I am in the midst of Israel, and that I am the Lord your God, and none else, and my people shall never be ashamed. So this is God saying, I'm in the midst of Israel. I'm here. I'm going where you go. Now the question is, do you recognize him, right? Do you know when he's there? Are you able to recognize that? Yeah. And in Psalms chapter 139, verse 7, this is in the Old Testament as well. Whither shall I go from thy spirit? Or whither shall I flee from thy presence? If I ascend up into heaven, thou art there. And if I make my bed in hell, thou art there. This is David writing Psalms, basically saying that wherever he goes, God is, and God is there. And it's very fascinating. I was actually listening to some Kabbalion or Kabbalah Judaism thought about God. And one of the key concepts that they talk about is that God created this creation as him being absent from the creation, not actually physically present in the creation, but he is consciously present in the creation, which allows us space to actually learn and grow and to improve. Yeah. And so he's there consciously, but not necessarily physically. It's a very fascinating thing. Perhaps I'll show a diagram or a little bit more in future episodes. And in really, it becomes interesting, right? We know that God is outside of our perception. We know that just because we can't see him or hear him or feel him doesn't mean he's not there. We just might not be using the right tools. So how do we see God? Now, I'm going to turn to scripture to get some insight here and to share with you. In Matthew chapter 5, verse 8, it says, blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. So in this sense, right, this goes back to what Joseph Smith had revealed to him, right? It's spiritual matter is only discerned by pure eyes. Yeah. And when you're pure in heart, you can see God. What does that mean to be pure in heart, right? What does that actually mean? Well, doesn't it mean that you become like a child and you're willing to be led by God in all circumstances. You're willing to actually focus. And if you remember how our unconscious mind can process 11 million bits of information per second, but our conscious mind only processes 126 bits. When you become conscious and you focus on actually seeing God in your life, you start to become aware of his presence. Yeah. And in 1 Corinthians chapter 2, verses 9 through 11, it says this, "But as it is written, eye hath not seen, nor ear heard, neither have entered into the heart of man the things which God hath prepared for them that love him." So when you start to see God, you're going to start to see the things that God has prepared for you because you love him. When you love him and you're pure in heart, you begin to see him. And it continues in verse 10, "But God hath revealed them unto us by his Spirit. For the Spirit searcheth all things, yea, the deep things of God. For what man knoweth the things of man, save the spirit of man which is in him? Even so the things of God knoweth no man but the Spirit of God." And so when you are actually seeking for God, it is not a physical action. It is a spiritual action. This is something that you must discern with spiritual eyes by getting your focus in line and saying, how do I want to see God today? I want to see God move, right? I want to see God work in my life. I want to see him, yeah? And really, ultimately, this idea is God's absence is his greatest presence. When God is absent from this reality, he actually has a very strong presence for you because now you can see him in the details. A lot of times people don't know God because they're unwilling to look for him in the details of their life. In fact, I heard this story at church today. There's a member, not in our ward, in another ward adjacent to us, who had been in a snowmobile accident, and all of you are safe and healthy. And he was quite injured. In fact, semi-paralyzed. He's not able to move his legs yet. It's possible that he could walk again. And all the way up before that time, he was adamant about building this apartment onto the side of his house. And he wanted this flat apartment, no stairs. He thought of putting in like a mother-in-law apartment that was flat on the ground, easy to get into. Well, now it's coming into handy because he needs a wheelchair. He needs to be taken right in, and there's no stairs there. It makes it really easy for him to live. We don't always know how God is working in our minds, and we're not always willing to see his presence, and we're not always able to see his presence when we're not focused on it. And the fact is that God is extremely present in all of our lives. It's just we're using the wrong instrument to see him. And when we see him, then we finally know that he's on our side. We can get into flow with God. We can start having divine flow. He can start leading us. He can start putting us in a direction that brings you joy and happiness that you want. And furthermore, this is what Joseph Smith had revealed to him in a Doctrine and Covenants, section 67, verse 11. This is more LDS scripture. "For no man has seen God at any time in the flesh, except quickened by the Spirit of God. Neither can any natural man abide the presence of God, neither after the carnal mind." Now, when actually seeing God, which Joseph Smith would know about, it isn't the physical body that actually sees God. There's this concept in LDS doctrine, LDS scripture. It's actually in the New Testament as well. There's a place that Jesus Christ went to called the Mount of Transfiguration, and he and his closest apostles were there with him, and his body was transfigured so that he could interact with celestial beings. Likewise, this is why Moses came down from the mount and was glowing, according to the people in the Old Testament, because the body was actually transfigured in order to see God physically. So the physical body must be transfigured. It must be changed in order to be in the presence of God. And God creates that power for someone else. Now, this is a rare circumstance. I don't think you're going to meet very many people, if any at all, that have been transfigured. The reality is, though, in order to see God, you must begin to see him in the details, to focus on how he's actually working in your life. Focus on the little things. Most people get up and they're not focused on this. They're focused on other things. They're focused on how am I going to make money today? I'm struggling, or my family's not doing so well, or the economy's bad, or people are suffering. These focus that you have is preventing you from seeing God. Instead, you can say, despite anything that's going on, I know that it's God's plan. So how can I see God working in this situation? How can I see how God is creating this for my benefit? How can I capitalize God's work that he's doing right now? Because when we focus solely on suffering, we're actually rejecting God in the moment. When we focus solely on our limitations, we're rejecting God in the moment, because God is limitless and he can heal all of us. He is all knowledgeable, omniscient, omnipresent, and he can do anything for us. We just need to have our focus aligned in that direction, and that's how we see him. And Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery, at one point, they saw Jesus Christ. In Doctrine and Covenants, section 76, verse 12, the whole section 76, talks about them seeing Jesus Christ. And it said this: by the power of the Spirit, our eyes were opened, and our understandings were enlightened, so as to see and understand the things of God. So really, if you're going to see and understand the things of God, your spirit, your eyes need to be opened by the Spirit, and your understandings enlightened. And so that's how you actually see him. You can see him in the details, and some have seen him through transfiguration. In any case, it's when the Spirit is opening your understandings, opening your eyes, yeah? And even you can hear God. How do you hear God, right? Not only how do you see God, you can also hear God, thinking about your senses, right? And in 1 Kings, this is in the Old Testament, chapter 19, verse 12, it says this: and after the earthquake, a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire, and after the fire, a still small voice. And we talk about this a lot in the LDS church, is this idea of a still small voice. It's that quiet voice that comes in when you're sitting still, when you're focused on having peace, when you're really looking for inspiration and revelation, when you're looking for God in the details. That's when the still small voice is going to come. In Doctrine and Covenants, section 136, verse 32, it says, let him that is ignorant learn wisdom by humbling himself and calling upon the Lord his God, that his eyes may be opened that he may see, and his ears open that he may hear. Now, when you're looking to hear God, when you're wanting to hear God, right, humble yourself and call upon him, yeah, that your ears may be open. Ask for your ears to be open. And even like Samuel of old, Samuel was a young boy in the Old Testament who became a prophet. And when he was a young boy, he basically says, here am I, Lord, I'm ready to listen, right? I'm listening. When you do that, God can come to you. It's just a matter of focus, a lot of this, right? And if we want to know how to feel God as well, there's a great story in the Doctrine and Covenants about Oliver Cowdery. Now, for those of you that aren't LDS listening to this, Oliver Cowdery was instrumental in creating the Mormon Church with Joseph Smith. Not only that, but translating the Book of Mormon. Oliver Cowdery was a scribe for Joseph Smith when Joseph Smith would look at a seer stone in a hat and get revelation about what the Book of Mormon had written there. And Oliver Cowdery would write down what it was. Yeah. And in Doctrine and Covenants, section 6, verse 22, it says, verily, verily, I say unto you. And by the way, before I read this, I'll mention this. Oliver Cowdery wanted to translate the Book of Mormon too. And so he asked Joseph Smith if he could get permission from the Lord to translate the Book of Mormon. In fact, the Lord told him he could if he would allow him to. And the problem that Oliver Cowdery had is that he kept questioning whether or not God would actually be there to help him translate. And this questioning is called doubt. And when there's doubt, there's not faith. And when there's not faith, there's not the power of God. And so it says in the scripture, this is the Lord's response to Oliver Cowdery. Verily, verily, I say unto you, if you desire a further witness, cast your mind upon the night that you cried unto me in your heart, and you might know concerning the truth of these things. Did I not speak peace to your mind concerning the matter? What greater witness can you have than that from God? So really, God is teaching Oliver Cowdery, peace is the way that you feel God. And I think that this is one of the best ways to know that you're perceiving God, because despite anything that's going on in your life, can you sit still and feel peace? As it says in the Old Testament, in Proverbs. Be still and know that I am God. This really is the big thing. This is how you know that God exists, is that you can fully put your trust in him. You can fully put your heart in him. You can fully know that he's there, that he's supporting you regardless of what is going on. And that brings peace into your heart. The reason why the peace is so important is because that is showing you how God is in the details. God is in everything and at the same time, not present, right? Because you feel that peace, yeah? His absence is his greatest presence. When you realize that you don't have to see God physically in front of you in order to see him work, to really know that he's there, that's going to make a big difference in your life. Likewise with that fishnet story, right? Those other scientists obviously told him to go back and find a better net, a better instrument, a better way to measure the size of fish. And when you think about measuring God, when you think about perceiving him, you really need a different way of looking at him, different instrument. And the instrument to use is spirituality. The instrument is to see with your spiritual eyes, to hear with your spiritual ears, to feel peace, right? And what I didn't know when I was a little kid lost to that stadium and I was praying, is that my parents were looking for me everywhere. They even went to the intercom and had announced that I had been lost, and they had people looking everywhere for a little kid. And finally, actually a family friend of ours, I remember his name is Robin. He found me sitting on the cooler and he looked at me and he said, I think your parents are looking for you right now. And he led me to my parents and I found them, right? And sometimes we find God in interesting ways, right? We don't know that he's out there actually searching for us, that he's telling other people to look for us, to bring us to him. And then ultimately, when we start looking for him, like I did when I was praying, then that's when he shows up. And really the moral of this, the way to know that God is there, that he's present, is to just simply focus on him being present in your life. Focus on seeing him there, because it's not God that needs to fit into our perception. It's actually us that fits into the reality of God. It's us that fits into his perception. And we can only know that when he is so much greater than us, so much bigger than us. We can only notice that when we actually allow ourselves to be part of him. And that's what Jesus Christ means when he says, my Father and I are one. Thank you for listening today. And if you haven't checked out the YouTube channel yet, please go to the YouTube channel and subscribe. The more subscribers we have to this, the more I can help other people hear this message and other messages that I'm sharing. And pretty soon, I want to continually expand interviewing again and start getting some really interesting guests on the show. Thank you again. Please subscribe, and we will talk next Sunday.